Hi, guys, and welcome back to another episode of Women in Math and STEM, where our mission is to reach out to as many professionals, aspiring professionals, students, whatever you name it. We try to reach out to them, who essentially support the initiative of bringing more women and young girls into the STEM field. So, with that being said, as always, feel free to open up the description or transcript to better follow along, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Hello, and thank you so much for coming to the call today and talking with me. Just to sort of start off, do you mind briefly introducing yourself and sort of walking us through your journey to get you where you are today?
Sure. First of all, hi, Angelina. Thanks for inviting me to be on your podcast. My name's Christopher Bishop. I'm technically a retired IBMer, but I describe myself as a nonlinear multimodal careerist. So I've had 8 careers so far, from touring rock musician to spending 15 years at IBM. I'm currently very involved in quantum information science. And among other things, I host something called the Quantum Tech Pod. I just published my 76th episode where I interview C-suite execs at leading quantum companies. And delighted to be here and talk more about my multiple careers and STEM.
I was just wondering, you've had so many careers throughout like your entire life. I was just wondering like what have you sort of learned from each one and how did you eventually end up at like IBM and doing quantum?
Let's say if there's any kind of theme that runs through my multiple careers, it's that of curiosity, being constantly curious, wanting to learn new things. And from a jobs and career perspective, being aware that technology drives innovation in terms of business models. So if you want to do something that's going to be viable for the next iteration of economic cycles, if you will, it's good to be aware of what's coming next. So, for example, when I was in New York, being a freelance bass player, I realized that in about 1985, music became data, meaning that you had the ability to sample and sequence audio and reproduce it from a stored medium. I ran a synclavier, which had something called a Winchester drive. 512K was the max memory, but you could summon timbres that had been recorded to a keyboard and manipulate them as data. So here's the drum parts, boom, boom, boom. Here's the strings, va da 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 da. Here's the trumpets, ba 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 ba. Here's the bass actually. So I learned how to use music as data. That was sort of an initial transition, but just an example of the ways that I've looked for leading edge technologies as a way to take my skills and curiosity and turn them into a career.
Sounds good. And I think you mentioned like congratulations on publishing your 76th episode. I was just wondering like what was the inspiration and motivation behind starting a podcast?
Well, um, I've been involved in quantum for a while, actually. In fact, I first became intrigued when I got a press pass to go to a quantum event in Boston that was produced by an organization called Inside Quantum Technology. It's run by a gentleman named Alan Meckler, who's a legendary tech event producer. He produced the first internet world at the Javits Center in New York City in like 1994, before anyone knew what the heck this internet World Wide Web thing was. So anyway, I went to this quantum event. We became friends. I met some of the quantum scientists involved, people leading innovative startups, and they asked me if I would be a moderator, if I knew enough about quantum to be a moderator. And I said, yeah, I mean, I worked at IBM for 15 years in a bunch of strategy and executive communications roles. So I knew how to figure out how to connect tech and business. Anyway, I was the MC for 5 events that we did during the pandemic. And I did them sitting right here, speaking into a webcam and into my fancy schmancy podcast microphone. And it evolved from there, and I began to get hired by other organizations. The Economist hires me now to moderate panels at their commercializing quantum events. I've been to London several times. I spent 2 days in Paris last year moderating the Quantum Innovation Summit in Dubai. I was in Singapore last April. And then Alan Meckler again suggested at one point, why don't you do a podcast? I think that would be a good way for us to expand our brand and make people more aware of this discipline. So I said, sure, let's do it. So that's like 3 years ago.
That's amazing. And I think you've mentioned before that like curiosity was a common theme between all your careers. I was just curious about like how you the transition was between like I don't want to say different, but like kind of different careers.
Yeah, I'd say different. Yeah, I mean, certainly going from being a musician to working in corporate headquarters at IBM was a big leap for sure. Um, but I think there's always a sort of theme about technology and curiosity that sort of led me to follow this path. I mean, I went from being a touring musician to being a studio musician in New York to being involved in the jingle business, writing music for television, using some of my music skills and learning computer skills, and then taught myself to be a web producer. Again, taking skills from being a jingle producer and moving them to the web biz. So I think it's worth recalling this story. In the jingle biz, right, writing music for television commercials, there's a set of actors and processes, right? There's a recording engineer and a singer and a guitar player and a copyist and a client and a budget and deliverable. So I learned who the actors were in the web space because I thought this World Wide Web thing was going to have global social, cultural, as well as business impact. So I learned who the actors were and what their skills were. So in the web biz, it's like, a graphic designer and a coder and a scripter maybe and an account executive and someone doing Q&A, checking out the end product to make sure it's not broken. So I just transferred my skills, learning enough about what those people did by taking classes in New York, by going to the New York Mac user group meetings, by staying up late surfing the web, looking at the source code, reading a lot of books, read a book about HTML, about this thick, and then hung out a shingle as a web producer and, had a couple of part-time engagements. And then this was the mid 90s, and a headhunter tracked me down and got me a job at a seminal interactive agency in New York. And I worked at that company for about a year and then at another agency for about another year and a half. And then, much to my surprise, after meeting a woman who worked at IBM on the train commuting into New York, I got an interview at IBM. She said, my organization is expanding. Would you ever think of working at IBM? And I said, I don't think so. Like, what would I do at IBM? She said, well, just go meet my VP. I think you'll have an interesting conversation at the very least. So I reluctantly agreed to go in, and I gave this VP of corporate internet programs my CV, my resume, and said, yeah, I was a rock musician. I was in a band that opened for the Eagles, and I toured with Robert Palmer. And she goes, no, no, I get it. She said, I'm a singer. But she said the same qualities that made you successful as a freelance bass player in New York City. I lived in Manhattan for 16 years. She said, will make you successful at IBM. She said, you're going to have to be a creative problem solver. You're going to have to be resourceful and resilient. You're going to have to be comfortable with ambiguity. You're going to have to be able to work across disciplines. You're going to have to be aware of your role as a global citizen. I mean, the sun never sets on IBM, to paraphrase Lord Calvin, right? We're cranking in 190 countries, 24/7. She said, can you start next week? And I was like, what? What did you say? Me? Anyway, I got hired, and again, I worked there in a bunch of different roles, strategy and comms, and a couple stints in corporate headquarters. So again, I would say to your viewers, those are qualities that are key to success in today's global borderless workplace, right? In the 21st century, those sort of 5 criteria. So keep those in mind when you're going on a job interview.
And I think when you introduced yourself, you mentioned that you were a non-linear multimodal careerist. I was just wondering, how has that sort of played to your advantage or sort of made you realize things that typical people don't?
Well, that's a great question. So to qualify, I have a degree in German literature from Bennington College. It's a small liberal arts school in Vermont. I minored in music, to be fair, but I mean, that was my major because I enjoyed it. I've been studying German since I was like in seventh grade, and it came easily to me. And I love the culture and the language and the literature and the music, of course. Um, but where I went to school, Bennington, they required you to design your own education after 2 years. So you had to put together a framework for what you were going to learn and who was going to teach you, and you had to defend it in front of basically a tribunal of professors and staff and admin, describing in detail, what it was you were going to study and how you're going to do it. So that's what has set me up for a life of lifelong learning, right? Learning how to learn, unlearn, and relearn, which is what I've been doing for 50 years in the workplace. And again, my admonition is that's how you and your peers, today's learners, are going to be working and learning, right? So I do lectures at universities now called How to Succeed at Jobs That Don't Exist Yet. And some of the aphora that I cite are a study by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics came out a few years ago that says that today's learners, pointing to you and your audience, are going to have 8 to 10 jobs by the time they're 38. Not because they have to, but because they can. Standard mean deviation indicates some will have more, some will have less, but that's just a general take on where the workplace trending is going, right? I think the amazing thing about that study is that it's coming from a public sector organization, meaning they have no agenda. It's not McKinsey or Deloitte. They're not trying to hire people, or it's not a big, Fortune 100 company. It's a public sector agency, part of the government, that says, this is what we found. Here's the data. Do what you will with it. The other three things I want to share with you are the common thinking is that 85% of the jobs that today's learners are going to be doing, say, in the next decade, have not been invented yet. That you'll be using technology that makes things like this look antiquated, right? And you'll be using it to solve problems we don't yet know are problems. I always say, especially to young people, get ready for an out of the mouths of babes comment from a grandchild in 30 or 40 years saying, you mean, Grandpa, you had to carry something around in your pocket to talk to Grandma? I mean, how antiquated was that? How inconvenient. So, thinking in terms of real world applications, there are now lots of open job recs for prompt engineers, people who can write succinct guidance for these large language learning models for ChatGPT and Gemini and on, right? So that wasn't a job 2 years ago, much less 5 years ago, right? So again, I encourage you to keep in mind that technology is going to drive and transform careers and skills and jobs.
Speaking of being like a lifelong learner, learning, unlearning, relearning, I was just wondering, what were some of the challenges in your life that you sort of had to like challenge assumptions or like struggle and overcome?
Well, so one of the first examples for me was when I moved to New York to see if I could run with the big dogs, foolish that I was. Having been in its band that toured for 3 years, I did 3 albums with them. We did some amazing gigs. But I moved to New York and was invited to a jam session because that's sort of how you meet people, right? You go to jam sessions. And it was with this quite legendary Japanese jazz guitar player. And it was him and me, the duo, right? So his first comment was, what tunes do you want to play? And I was like, what do you mean? He said, well, I have a real book here. Let's pick a jazz standard and play it, right? And I did not know any jazz standards. I had never dealt with a real book. A real book has these charts that look like, here, I'll show your viewers. This is actually from a digital version, which is called the iReal book, but it looks like this. This is actually the final countdown, but all these kind of bebop tunes, show tunes from the 40s, jazz standards are in, it's a thick book. And I had never seen one. So needless to say, I had to figure out how to do that. I think it was almost the next day or within that same week, I was at another jam session farther downtown at a loft. And the guitar player turned to the sax player who was hosting the event and said, hey, Matsuo had a jam session the other day and the bass player didn't know any tunes. Do you believe that? I was like, Chuck, that was me. I was the guy that didn't know any tunes. So anyway, I called up a friend from college who knew how to play bebop and read a real book and said, Randy, I gotta figure this out. Like, this is what This is required skill in New York. If I'm going to be a bass player in New York City, I got to know how to do this. So he said, fine. So we bought a real book. He pointed me to where you get them, and I bought one. And he sat with me and we went through it. Here's how it works. These are the tunes you've got to learn. These are the, like, 20, 25 tunes you've got to know. Classic standards, they're called. And I figured it out. But it was embarrassing and it was painful. I took sight reading classes at the studio in New York. And so, all by way of saying, I had a set of skills that were transferable. I could play the bass, in various settings, rock and roll and country and R&B settings, but not in jazz settings. So that was the gap. I had to learn how to play jazz tunes. And I tracked down someone to teach me and I found resources. And again, that's a meta model for all of you listening to and watching this podcast, that you're going to find in a work situation that you have skills that are transferable, something you know how to do that you learned either in school or at another job. And there's going to be a delta, there's going to be a gap. You're going to have to figure out what you don't know how to do, and then figure out where you can learn that skill and go learn it and apply it and then do it again. It's going to happen over and over and over.
Sounds good. Sort of on the same note, I was wondering if you had any pieces of advice, suggestions, recommendations, honestly, anything for students, whether it be like high school or college students who are interested in like studying or like having a career in the future.
Yeah. So I put together something I call the Future Career Toolkit. And I've actually written a book and I have a publishing deal, and it's going to come out probably next spring. But the Future Career Toolkit, and I go through this when I do lectures at universities, the tools are voice, antenna, and mesh. Voice is an exercise where you take your favorite book, TV show, game, or movie and think about what about it resonates with you, right? What aspect of it appeals to you? And you use that to find your voice, if you will, your brand, your personal brand, your product identification, if you will. So for me, it's like um, Blade Runner 2049 is a movie. And it's about the future and technology and business and culture. And then for a book, I picked a book called More, The History of Economics from the Iron Age to the Information Age, because I'm fascinated by the way technology and economics drives careers and jobs, right? So those are kind of my focus areas. The second tool is called Antenna, and what that does is it requires you to go out and look for where conversations are going on around those topics. So they're going on in Bloomberg, on TV. There's a daily show at 5 o'clock that's talking about technology and business. BBC Click is a similar show that talks about tech and business and R&D in the tech space. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal are sources. I follow the BBC News on Instagram. So that's the antenna piece. And then the mesh piece is building a network, a mega network, right? Tracking down the actual people and companies and organizations that are leading this work, leading the thinking. And I always contend there's always a Miles Davis in every discipline. There's a Serena Williams, there's a Taylor Swift, there's a Tony Hawk. Find those people and who they're connected to and connect with them and follow them and follow their blogs, follow their company. So that's what I would say. The other thing I'll say at a general level is chase the maelstrom, find the chaos, go for the mayhem. Meaning go where they don't know what it is yet. The royal they being existing business models, right? So again, ChatGPT, OpenAI, that wasn't a successful business probably 3 years ago, but that'd be a cool place to work. SpaceX, another example, right? The burgeoning space economy. Certainly any of dozens of quantum companies, from big companies like IBM, which has a very robust quantum practice, to any of a number of startups that are working in the quantum space around sensing, around communications, around quantum cryptography. So that's sort of my general guidance.
And then just to sort of end off, I was wondering if you had any last words you'd like to share with the audience.
So when I do my lectures at universities, I typically close with this kind of comment. I look at the students and I say, you guys and gals are going to do stuff that's going to look like magic to me. So get to it. I want to see some of it. I mean, compared to when I was your age, when I was in college, there were no cell phones, no personal computers, no electric vehicles, no Facebook, no Twitter. I mean, it was like putting quarters in a payphone to call home from college and say, Mom, I want to be a musician. So, what I would say to you is there's lots of interesting and exciting work to do, topics to study, things to learn about, and you should pursue them. Follow your gut, trust what your heart says about what you're interested in doing, and go for it. But again, find something at the bleeding edge. Find something that's net new, because that's where you'll be able to do something interesting and creative, and also be involved in sort of an evolving workspace, if you will, and get paid, make a living.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. It was absolutely phenomenal talking to you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for inviting me.